Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's edition of the Curation Corner, a part of our learning journey here at the Human School. Each week, we engage in brief conversations around a resource, summarizing the author's ideas, making connections to our own experiences, and sharing insights that further our learning here at the Human School and with the Human School Compass. In this episode, we're chatting about the article Q&A, Planning for the Futures by Tabitha Wishamore. You can find a link in the video description below, as well as on the Human School. So this article is a Q&A format focused on a conversation with an entrepreneur, Parminder Jassal, on how and why we can develop a futures mindset. Those with a futures mindset see possibility. That's one of my big takeaways. They believe that the choices that we make today help to shape the future. The future doesn't just happen to us, we can actually shape it. So how can we exercise a futures mindset? 2 suggestions from the article. Look for signals. So what might be if a signal scales for the future? And second, think years ahead, not just weeks or days, which seems to be something that's more like human nature. The article mostly focuses on higher education, specifically community colleges, and the importance of the futures mindset. But there was one quote that struck me. Awakening and retaining a futures mindset requires a community to practice the art and science of investigating possible futures and then building the bridge back to the present for action. So reading this article, and especially the quote about practicing in community, made me ask myself 2 questions. First, how are we organizing in community to support the shifts in mindsets that we know we need to happen? While futures thinking is embedded in one of our mind shifts, there are at least 8 others that we've identified here at the Human School. Without a community, we're going to get pulled back to our fixed ways of thinking about education and schooling. And my second question, how are we helping our young learners develop a futures mindset? I don't see this at all in our schools, and I wonder how we're selling our learners short without this critical mindset. I'm reminded of the organization Teach the Future, which focuses on futures thinking as part of what we teach in schools. So I'm curious to hear what you all think about that article.
For me, the part that resonated the most was around this, the futures mindsets, the 4 kind of traits that she highlights. But the big one for me was on focusing on what could happen rather than what will happen. And it made me realize, and I think your question, Randy, the last one you asked about why this doesn't exist in school, I think a big part of it is the belief that there is only one right answer or one right outcome to everything. So I will say that I'm even a little bit uncomfortable with the idea of designing backwards from a potential future if there is an identified one right future, if that makes sense. So it's like, how do you create conditions that allow you to arrive at many different outcomes or many different futures that are all, I'm going to say, positive, right? Because we want to try to avoid catastrophe or bad outcomes. But I guess just so much of our current traditional system right now is built around there being one right way of doing things. There's one right way to talk about data. There's one right answer for a standardized test. There's one right way to design curriculum. There's one right way to lead. And, I think your point about schools not being places that embraces the future mentality is because everything we do is built around, designing a budget the one right way. Everything we do is about the one right way.
Yeah, that line was the one that really resonated for me too, that idea of could. I'll push back and say, I think that designing for the negative is important too. I don't think that you meant it this extremely, but I think that oftentimes when we teach kids that this is the path that you're going to go on, and when it doesn't happen, they don't know what to do. So having a variety and saying like, there's a bunch of different ways that our lives can turn out, and, all sorts of terrible things are going to happen along the way. So like, what are the skill sets that you need in order to deal with the good and the bad, the difficulty and the benefit? And I mean, I don't know, not to get like too dark, but I mean, we're talking about some pretty intense issues around climate change and like kind of some scary outcomes that very much could be part of their lives as adults. And not that like we actively plan and plant that seed. I'm not advocating for like, I don't know, metal lined walls in the basement bunker or something like that. But that like there is some kind of scary stuff that could happen in their lifetime, and that are there ways to help them. Like I think about it in terms of standards. One of the things that I think about a lot is the focus that we have on standards around content and knowledge as opposed to skills, and like what would it look like to let go of all of the delineated content and just work around what are the universal skills that regardless of whatever comes, and whatever you do, that you need to be able to do. Like we all need to communicate effectively and clearly. We all need to be able to sort through information and make decisions for ourselves. Imagination and creativity is pretty critical. So what would that even look like? And how would that help in whatever negative or positive future that comes? So I agree with you. I really liked that word of could versus will. And I appreciate your point about how much of what we talk about in education is certainty when it's just not certain.
So one of the connections I'm making between your two things that you just shared is this idea that when we talk about foresight, one of the steps in the process is scenario creating, designing, and we do design multiple scenarios too, and they're not always the best possible outcome. But then when you have these multiple scenarios, then you say which is the most preferable scenario and which is the one that I want to take action towards, that I could actually make that preferable outcome or the desirable outcome actually happen. And that helps reinforce in our minds that we do have some control over what we do and how we get to that particular outcome. And it reminds me, there's a new book out, Jane McGonigal. She's a futurist at Institute for the Future in California, and she has a new book out called Imaginable. And she tells a story in the beginning about how I think it was 2012 or 2011 or something like that, she had run an online game. Her expertise is gaming, and she does scenario planning through game design. And so the scenario was a pandemic in the year 2020 or 2018 or something like that. And what she says about the story was that the people that played the game, which is something like 10,000 people played this game online, the scenario game, it actually helped them map out various scenarios that actually came to be, so that even though they're not, like Rachel suggested, not a positive outcome, you thought about how you might deal with that. So one of the scenarios was like, the economy is shut down, all schools are closed, you can't go out. Like, what do you do? And so working through that scenario, the people that actually 10 years later lived that got back to her and said something to the effect of like, it helped me prepare mentally for what I was going to do in that situation. So all those different scenarios, you think about them, it helps you prepare for whatever that future is, and then you can choose which is the preferred one and which is the one I'm going to work towards, with those other ones in the back of your mind in case you do run across those things. So very interesting book, Imaginable by Jane McGonigal, that kind of connects to our article today.
I in a little bit of a different direction here. In the author talks about the disruption to community colleges and like place-based learning, and the rise of things like MOOCs, which are not as as a big of a deal now, but how the community college has been disrupted by other professors. And I guess one of the things that I wanted to highlight there was that articulation in the article is a perfect example of not having foresight. So right now, what we've got is a situation where there's this constant tension in the college world of being able to physically have a place to go and whether we're ever going to get back to that. And it's probably not realistic to think about, although maybe I'm being short-sighted here, K-5 or K-8 being non-place based in the sense that, we've talked about the custodial nature of school, but even high schools, why does high school have to be a physical place that you go to every single day? And so again, I think that she does a really wonderful job of articulating what it is and then providing some examples of how people have not probably done that futures thinking to prepare themselves for the current reality that they're facing as an industry.
Yeah. And I think too that it connects to the part where she talks about years in advance, and the nature of, I think it's Western culture that likes to plan for the short term, right? I think about like indigenous cultures where you're making decisions that are meant to be 7 and 8 generations out, depending on the tribe and the community, and that was how they made decisions for the long term. That was always about this long term planning, and I think in schools, I think going back to what Randy was saying about what sort of alternative futures exist for students, having that same conversation about school. Oftentimes, I remember years ago in class, I taught an argument class, and we would have this sort of set of readings, and kids would make arguments of their own choosing based on one of the themes that they saw. And all of the articles talked about automation and how so many times when we talk about that, the argument is, well, we have to stop that. How do you put the toothpaste back in the tube, right? Like you're already in that path. And so being able to think about that there are some places and some things that you can't make it not happen. Or instead of can't, if we think about could versus will, what if you can't make it not happen? So what could you do in order to exist in that environment? So for students, but also for schools, what if we do come to a place where even in elementary, like some of the micro schools, I think that there was the one in Chicago that we talked about at one point that doesn't have a building, that they have kids in different places based on their interests for periods of time, working or existing with other employers, not at the elementary level, but that what if that's what happens with schools? What does that mean for our world years from now? What is it that we want for our kids, not even just at college, but, as like grown adults, or what do we want for their children, or what do we want for our own children? I think that conversation from a school standpoint is a really interesting one. And I think it's one that we fight really hard against having. We just want what's changing to stop, as opposed to thinking about the permutations that could come and how we might deal with them, as opposed to, well, no, I just want to go back. You kind of can't. So,
yeah, we tend to be very reactive as opposed to proactive. And we always tell our kids we want them to be proactive. But human nature is that we tend to be more reactive than proactive. And so having a futures mindset is breaking that and moving from or navigating from being reactive to being proactive. All right. We finish each of these conversations around the curation article with a couple of questions for our viewers to think about. Here are this episode's questions. How are we organizing in community to support shifts in mindset, including the futures thinking mindset? In particular, I'm wondering about the element of the futures mindset where we will think about what could happen. How can we help others to design possible outcomes instead of driving towards certainty? And lastly, what steps might we take to incorporate future signals in our work to encourage futures thinking? Thanks for learning alongside us here in this episode of the Human School's Curation Corner. Visit thehuman.school and its conversations page for additional resources, and join the conversation in our Facebook community committed to placing humanity at the center of all design. Bye for now.